everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with week 4 of Keep It Holy, remembering the Sabbath every day of your life. Thank you for being here. I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving. And I'm going to say this again at second service, if I can remember. I forgot. So I didn't have the greeting today because I was the preacher. And so I meant to say this at the beginning of my sermon, but I forgot. So if you hear this again at second service, you'll just have to pretend you didn't. But I had a deal with Mark Telke. I said, if Michigan can beat Ohio State 4 straight years in a row, we're going to hang some new blue banners in the sanctuary. And he did. Thank you, Mark. He must have come in last night and put them up. Those are beautiful new Advent banners we have. So makes that white wall feel full of color. All right, so here's where we've been. There's a handout back there for weeks 1 through 3 that kind of summarizes everything we talked about. We began by recognizing that the third commandment, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as it was practiced by the Jews, obviously changes with the coming of Christ, and nobody seems to care, including the early church. And so we would be maybe apt to just toss it out, but then we realize it's part of the Ten Commandments. Maybe there's something more to this. And then, of course, the early church kept a Sabbath, so to speak, the Lord's Day. On Sunday, they continued to worship and gather, although they didn't seem to worry about the refraining from work. And so we watched how the Jews treated the Sabbath, and then how maybe some modern-day Protestants or even Catholics, what they've done with the Sabbath in their traditions. And then week 2, we watched what Luther did with the Sabbath, and saw that focus on worship and hearing God's Word, which seemed to be different than he treated all the other commandments, and we explored some historical context as to maybe why he did that. And then last week we took a good hard look at the Scriptures and what it teaches about the Sabbath from front to back. And what we hinted at was a new direction for Sabbath, an understanding of Sabbath as the celebration of life sort of lived in accordance with God's will, as Adam and Eve on that first Sabbath day rested, or maybe a better translation for that Hebrew verb is to celebrate. They relished, they took in all that God had done, and they lived in harmony with God and His creatures. And so to keep the Sabbath day holy might have everything to do with celebrating life by God's design. And that's sort of where we left it. So there's, like I said, a handout that summarizes all that if you want to take it. And then my wife said, I can't follow your classes unless there's a handout, so that's why there's these handouts. So week 4, she needs something to doodle on. Today we're going to talk about work. And so just kind of like these 2 lessons set up something that was only resolved in lesson 3. The next 2 lessons on work and leisure, this is an old, this should be called Living the Receptive Life, and Sleep and Play is the last lesson. I forgot to change the slide out. But work and leisure seem like totally opposite things, don't they? Work, leisure.
No.
And yeah, we're going to see them both as facets of what Sabbath living looks like, and then we'll kind of resolve on week 6 when we talk about living the receptive life. So I apologize for the slide. So in the introduction of his book, Day 7, Bierman says this. He says, while some aspect of work figures prominently in the lives of every single person, it is rather remarkable that most people expend little effort and pay almost no attention to what they actually think and understand about the very idea of work. Think about that for a minute. Think of how much of our lives we spend working, and we just sort of take it for granted. But what's the meaning of work? What's the purpose of work? How should we think about it theologically? Rarely do we do that, and so today's a chance to do that. Is it merely a means to an end, the requisite capital for pursuing a life filled with gusto? Or is it the basic defining purpose and meaning of my life, exemplified by laborers who can with glowing satisfaction and even joy declare, I was born to do this? And you could probably say to yourself, well, there's a hint of truth in both of that. I mean, we have to work to eat. It is a means to an end. For some privileged people in this world, work can even be a sense of joy and satisfaction, but probably can't say that of everybody's form of employment. So how do we think through that? And what if your work is demeaning and degrading or soul-crushing and so alienating to your very humanity? And finally, when does work stop and play begin? So those are kind of some themes that we will explore. So what is work? Let's think about this for a minute, and you can kind of follow along on your outline. We're in letter A, and I realize the last letter should be F and it's D, but just ignore that. Probably when you heard the word work, you think of the labor that you do to make money or you get paid for it. That's probably most people's first thought about work. But we should also think about the ordinary routines of life. They're often onerous or burdensome, and we don't get paid for them, but they're nonetheless work. So bodily care, we need to buy food, we need to prep food to eat. That can be enjoyable, but it can also be a burden. Laundry. God bless all the moms out there. And maybe if you're a good dad, you help too, but laundry with 3 kids, unbelievable. The machine is always going. Always going. I can't wait for the first one to move out. For him to realize how much laundry was being done for him. Yeah, as he does it. Hygiene. Hygiene takes a fair amount of time, depending on how particular you are, but it takes time nonetheless, and sometimes it's valuable time. Fitness. Many of us maybe take the time for fitness that we should, but that's another thing, the bodily care, the routines of life. What about home care? Cleaning your house, paying your bills, doing your yard work, maintaining your home. All of that is labor as well. And then finally, probably the one that's most overlooked is raising your family or taking them to and from their activities, etc. So almost every facet of life could be considered work in some way. Now, what we want to recognize is that, especially in our American society today, and this is probably becoming less true, but for most of our lifetimes has been true, we have been shaped by the lingering effects of what used to be called the Protestant work ethic. A lot of Puritan and Calvinistic influence in America from a religious perspective, and work was seen as a duty and something you did out of obligation. That's one way you practiced your faith, was to do your job well. And so you grow up hearing things like work before play, or hard work never killed anyone or hurt anyone, or maybe this one, I'd never heard this, but many people have, be it big or be it small, do it well or not at all. And so we have this ethos, this focus on the importance of work in our society that comes first of all from a religious standpoint, but that starts to wane. This American capitalist attitude sort of gladly fills that in, and this is the idea of climbing the corporate ladder, keeping up with the Joneses. Probably I would say like the pinnacle of this in pop culture was a movie I have never watched, but I know what he says in it. Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street, where he declares greed is good. You think of the 80s and just how much emphasis there was on moving up in the organization and stuff, and that kind of continues into the 90s, but I feel like there's a different attitude toward work today, and I'll show you why I think that reason is. So what we saw was the attitude around work didn't change much, but the underlying reasons for it did, and that was a result from a shift from what some philosophers have called spiritual man, where God determines my reality, to economic man, where how much you make, what you do is the most important thing. And so largely today, still, I think is the case, we measure a person's value or worth based on what they do. If you're a doctor or a lawyer, you're very important, right? You work in a factory, yeah, you're important, but you're a little less important. And then, of course, I mean, the least important of all is the mom that stays at home. She doesn't make any money, right? And that's misguided way of thinking about work, because all work has value, whether you get paid for it or not, or depending on how much you get paid for it. And so we've had misguided attitudes about work. When you ask someone, what do you do? 2 men meet on the street, what do you do? They're going to probably answer with the job they make money for first. And that still shows that our occupations define our identity, our meaning and purpose more than anything else. And I would say that's especially true for men. Nothing is more life-wrecking and damaging to a man than losing his job, losing his financial labor and compensation, the means by which he puts food on the table and a roof over his family's head. But we're seeing a shift. Now, the philosophers would say we're no longer economic man, we're psychological man. And this started kind of with Freud, but now it's sort of mainstream. And the goal is to be pleased. And what you're finding, the big joke about the younger generation that's entering the workforce right now is what? They don't much like to work. Or they want to work at home. Or only have to go into the office this many days of the week. They used to give, right, boomers in the workforce classes about how to deal with these younger workers. Now they're giving the younger workers classes on how to deal with the old farts. Okay? So even corporations are sort of succumbing to this. And so it's no surprise that after the COVID pandemic, right, it's like, what do you mean I have to go back into the office, right? Now that's not necessarily all bad, because work shouldn't be so defining in our lives that it defines everything, but neither should just not really wanting to work. So let's think about different ways we can look at work, all right? Let's just think about work for a minute theologically. And I'm going to show you 4 models. These are by Gilbert Meilander from his book, Working, Its Meaning and Limits. So one way we could see work is as co-creation. So God made the heavens and the earth, and He's continuing to create, and He does so through human beings, okay? So we are sort of an extension of God's activity in His arm in the world. Work then is seen as holy because it's part of God's work in and through us. And it's a source of personal fulfillment, meaning, and satisfaction. To know that God is using you to provide whatever service you provide to the world, that He is making new things through you and your intellect and your abilities, that can be very satisfying. And so that's one way to think about work. The ancients thought about work quite differently, though. They thought about work as just something that's necessary so that you can have leisure time, right? Not a working for the weekend. That would be kind of a modern way to think about it. But you work enough to provide the basic needs of a house and a home and food on the table so that you have the necessary time to do more important things in life. And for them, that wasn't skiing at the lake. It was reflecting on the meaning of life, thinking about morality, etc. So we're going to talk all about what they meant by leisure next week. But work was sort of an interruption. Right? If you could, you'd spend all your time just pondering the meaning of life, but you can't because you got to eat, so I guess you got to go to work. And you can see how there's truths in both of these, but they're very different ways of thinking through what work is. Now, you may have noticed a problem with seeing work as co-creation, and this is what Karl Marx really lamented when he was having his heyday, is that work was such an alien thing, and it was not always honoring the dignity of people. And so maybe a more sober way to look at work is it is dignified, it is using God working through you, but it's also irksome, right? Work can be difficult. Labor can be hard. Sometimes people are undercompensated for what they do. For some people, they don't have the advantage of going to a job every day where they feel like, I'm using my gifts to make the world a better place. For some of them, it's drudgery, and it's just something they have to do. For many in the history of our world, work has been a crushing reality that grinds them back into the dust and leaves them wasting away and ready to die. So we may disagree with Marx's economic theories, I get all that, but there was something to what drove him initially to his theories, and it was watching people do meaningless work and be divorced from the fruits of their labor. And you may have a hard time appreciating that. I'll just throw this observation out there. Nobody I've seen in life whose dad went to work and sweated hard for a living seems to adopt this victim mentality that's so common among today's people. When I look across my high school classmates and I see the attitudes of who they are as adults, I've yet to see someone who had a dad who was a blue-collar worker, right, claim victim status. I've had lots of people who had everything handed to them with their kids now feel like they're victims, right? How work has shaped us can shape how we see work today. But But none of these are really the way that Lutherans have typically understood work, because one of Luther's primary contributions was seeing work as a vocation, and vocation means it's something we're called to by God. Work is affirmed as valuable, but there's also a recognition that it demands a lot of us. There's a responsibility given to us in our work, and that can be burdensome to shoulder that responsibility, even if it's a calling from God. The distinctive thing about Luther's understanding of work is it's not about me feeling personally fulfilled and using what God has given me to do good in the world. Rather, the value that my work brings is service to my neighbor. If I'm a doctor, I bring about healing. If I'm a lawyer, I help you with your legal struggles. If I'm a factory worker, I provide some product that improves your life and makes it better. But the focus was not on me. It was on who I serve through my vocation, or better yet, who God is serving through me. But there have been some detractors of Luther's understanding of work. Some have said, well, this just seems to dismiss individual interests or the intrinsic value of work. And Luther probably would have taken that criticism and said, yep, it's not about you, right? But if work is something God has created us to do, then maybe there is something to finding fulfillment in it. And so as we look through these different models of work, what we see is that there's sort of a problem, well, not a problema, a problem, and an enigma to the reality of work. So what is it? Is it a source of meaning and purpose? Is it an essential part of what it means to be human? Or is it something that we do because we live in a fallen world and it's at best a toilsome imposition on more enjoyable things in life, more humane pursuits? Is work, at the end of the day, a gift or is it a curse? And is it possible to see work as anything other than the polar opposite of Sabbath rest? Okay? So, on one sense, I think we can see work as a gift. Let's look at Genesis 2, the creation account. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with its seed and its fruit, you shall have them for food. Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And so because work precedes the fall and is part of God's original design for Adam and Eve in the garden, what we have to kind of consider is that work is God's idea. He didn't just put humans on earth to be idle or to enjoy creation or to contemplate the meaning of life. He actually placed Adam and Eve in the garden and said, I got a job for you to do, right? Human beings are designed to work. Work is God's idea. At the same time, work is a curse now. From Genesis 3, after the fall, to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. And here's kind of that key line. By the sweat of your face you shall eat the bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And so even though work is a beautiful gift created by God that human beings are to enjoy and find fulfillment in, the reason we have such a hard time conceiving of a model for work is because there's another aspect of work that's frustrated. And no matter how fulfilling your job is compared to somebody else's, there are challenges in your job because your job is carried out in a fallen world among fallen people. And we continue to be surprised by a fallen world, don't we? I mean, when you start a new job, don't you think, oh, so this is going to be the place, right? Everything's going to go well here. Boy, the people I met at the interview are so nice. Look at this building. They keep it so clean, right? And has anybody ever had this high optimism when you start a new job? Yeah, and then what? A couple weeks in, right, you move Joe down the cube, right? You realize Joe doesn't pull his own weight. He's a drag on the organization, but somehow he's fooled management and they think he's all that. He got the next promotion, and all of a sudden you realize, this isn't much different than the place I left. You know, now what? And sooner or later, you just have to realize, this is what work is like in a fallen world. It's never as pure and as clean as we would hope it would be. This is why I'm especially nervous when new members or members who haven't been involved in church leadership get on a board for the first time or decide to really dive in and serve in some area. I'm always a little nervous because I've seen it happen enough that changes their whole perspective about their church because they realize they're sinners here too. Right? So work is a gift and it's a curse, but importantly, I think we need to realize that work will be restored on the last day as a source of greatest joy. If part of our eschatological hope is that God is making right the world that has fallen, and if part of the original design of creation involved a joysome work, and then that is going to be, we assume, restored on the last day. And so as Christians, living here and now, we have to sort of realize and recognize that joy even in the midst of the fallen realities of work. Okay? So I'm saying that the new heavens and the new earth, there will be a job for each of us to do. And it will be something that we look forward to. And there won't be John from the cubicle down the hall, right? Because John will be fully restored in Jesus, or maybe John's in hell and out of my sight and I don't believe in him. So either way, it's okay. So why are we talking about... I didn't know I was going to say that. Why are we talking about this in this class? Well, the restoration and joy of work begins now, and Bierman will argue, and I agree, in this book he likes to have his cake and eat it too, but he will argue that finding joy in your vocation or seeing it as service, that's part of what Sabbath living is, a part of what Sabbath living is. All right? Now, he's not without biblical counsel on this. I know this is kind of small. If you brought your Bibles, we're in John 5, and even I'm going to have trouble reading this on my chart here. Now, listen to this account from John 5. It says, after this, there was the feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was a Sabbath. And we already looked last week about how Jesus loves to heal and restore creation on the Sabbath. He wants to teach people that the Sabbath, it's okay to do good on the Sabbath, right? So he's overcoming some of the prior Jewish assumptions about what Sabbath living meant. And so John here wants to help us see that. And so he says, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." And you remember, maybe back to lesson 1, we talked about the things you couldn't do on the Sabbath for Jews, and one of them was transport property from one area to another. And so this is clearly a violation of their interpretation of the Torah. But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk,'" right? They asked him, "Who is the man who said this to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in this place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you who are well, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Here's the line. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." That is why the Jews were seeking to all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father. And then Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son of Man can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and has shown him all that he himself is doing, and greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel." But there's that idea of working being part of what the Sabbath means. That it's okay to work on the Sabbath, especially doing the good work of the Lord on behalf of your neighbor. And there's one more place where this theme of working, this is in John 9, another healing account. He passed by and saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" But Jesus answered, "It was not this man that sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, for night is coming when no one can work." Okay, and then he heals the guy. I'll skip down to this third paragraph. It says, "They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been formerly blind." And then here again, John wants to write, "Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees asked him again how he had received his sight, and he said to them, 'He put mud on my eyes and washed, and I see.' Some of the Pharisees said, 'This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath.' But others said, 'How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?'" Again, so John highlights the importance of sort of work being part and parcel of what the Sabbath is. Let me just kind of look at my outline here and see where I'm at. Okay. Any questions so far? All right, so I said earlier that Luther's other big breakthrough was his doctrine of vocation. So I think three things Luther gave to the church. The distinction of law and gospel, which was there in St. Augustine and St. Paul, more importantly. Luther really recovers the proper distinction between law and gospel, and that is filtered down through the generations. Four things. Luther gave us the two kinds of righteousness, right? The idea that I'm passively made righteous by my God, and I do nothing, but also, much neglected, his treatment of the act of righteousness by which I'm called to serve my neighbor, and that, in that sense, I am called to do. Luther gave us the two kingdoms, or the two realms that Dr. Bierman spoke eloquently about, the two lessons he was with us there. And then finally, I would say, maybe Luther's greatest contribution that's pervaded more than Lutheran circles, actually, is his doctrine of vocation. So when we teach kids this, we have to enunciate, because they might hear doctrine of vacation or something like that. But vocation comes from the Latin vocatio, where we get our word vocal or voice, and it means to call. And this is the idea that God calls us into our various callings and gives us a job to do. And that means more than just the job we get paid for. For Luther, there were three primary estates in which we exercise our callings as Christians. One was the economia. That's where we get our word economy. In Greek, it's oikonomia, which means house law. And so for Luther, the economy was not primarily work. It was that, but it also had your family was involved. Now, I've separated these here because we obviously do that in our modern day world. Work is a place you go and family's at home. But in Luther's day, the distinction wasn't so great. And this is the example I always give, but if your dad was a cobbler and fixed shoes, what was likely that your job was going to be? You were going to be that too, right? You were going to learn the family trade. Your family and what you ended up doing were highly bound up together. If your dad worked in the coal mines, what were you probably going to do? You get a job at the coal mines. So Luther was really unique in his day, that his dad worked in the mines, but he had enough money to send Luther to school to become a lawyer. That was really something, that upward mobility, that was just beginning to happen. But it was just starting, and it wasn't even in people's mindset that your job you would go to would be so much different from your family. Of course, now we take that for granted. But economy, oikonomia in Greek, just means house law. And think about that. That's the way the household is managed. All the things you needed to do if you were a cobbler. You need to have the supplies to fix the shoes. You had to order them, make sure your incomes didn't exceeded your outgoes, etc. And sort of managing all that so that there was food on the table. The other estate that everybody lived in, of course, was the politia, or the political realm, that was being citizens of whatever jurisdiction you were under. Today we would say we're citizens of America. We're citizens of the state of Missouri. We're citizens of the local municipality of St. Peter's or St. Charles or O'Fallon. And then finally, the last estate, of course, for Christians, and in Luther's day, everybody in Europe was really born and baptized a Christian, not so much anymore in America, but it was the ecclesia, or the church, where we fulfilled our calling as disciples. Okay? So in each of these estates, or sometimes you call them spheres of existence, we have different responsibilities. We have responsibilities at our job, in our family, whether we're children, aunts, uncles, fathers, mothers, grandparents. Every one of those calls us to a different kind of responsibility. Maybe we're on some local boards in our municipality. There's ways that we serve. Maybe we coach a Little League team or a youth football team, whatever it may be. And then, of course, at church, we have various roles too. To worship faithfully, to help carry out the work of the church on behalf of others, etc. And these responsibilities are given to us by God. We don't choose them, right? How many of you decided how many siblings you were going to have when you grew up? Nobody. How many decided what kind of family structure you were going to be born in, or where you were born? Right? God popped you into the world where you were and the circumstances you were. And then if you even think about the course of your life, the various places it's taken you or the different jobs you've done, you kind of look back, how did I get here? How did it arrive? And maybe in hindsight you could sort of see God steering you and calling you into that. But the most important part for Luther about our vocation was that they are simply masks by which he serves our neighbor. And so if you are a plumber and you fix someone's leaking pipe and get them back dry again, Luther would say, God did fix your pipe, but he did throw it so through the hands of a plumber. You see, that plumber is just a mask of God through which he serves you. And a couple other things about our vocation, and this gets back to the frustrated aspect of work, is we bear our crosses in vocation. Every single one of you that works in any of these vocations has a cross that you bear in them. There will be plenty of crosses to bear, and they are given to you by God. We don't need to seek them out. That's one of the biggest problems with a victim mentality in society, is people are running out trying to find a cross and say, see how persecuted I am. Hey, if you serve faithfully in whatever vocations God has set you in, you will find your cross there. And whatever it is, we're called to bear it with gladness and to work through it and to realize this is because part of work is frustrated. And then, so I just taught this class at Irvine last spring on a whim, church ethics class, theological ethics, and there was a whole lesson on work, and I had to read these articles that Dr. Lloyd assigned for the class, and then I had to teach them, which is always fun to teach something you've never learned yourself. But one of the biggest insights of that whole unit for me was everybody that thinks theologically about work says work is a tool God uses to sanctify Christians. You become more holy and more Christ-like through encountering challenges at your job and working through them with dignity and grace. I just thought that was a fantastic insight. Rather than just complaining about all these problems we have, how is God, why did he put them in my life, and how is he shaping me to serve him better by those crosses? Now, it doesn't make them any easier to bear or any less frustrating, but I think it does help you step back and see a perspective in it, right? All these things about, biting your tongue. I remember when I was a young second lieutenant in the Air Force, again, my dad worked in a factory, and he called a spade. And I would sit in these meetings with professionals from Northrop Grumman who'd been working, 20, 30 years in their company, and I would just blurt out, something like, these people aren't doing their job right. And everybody would just kind of look at me like, shh, you don't say that in public, Like, what's so wrong with it? Well, there was a code of the road there that showed some deference and respect to these business professionals who had made their way, and there were ways to address that were more polite and dignified. Now, I never did really learn that lesson that well. Okay? You can't overcome your upbringing so easily. But there's things, there's lessons we learn, or there's better or worse ways to deal with issues in our vocations than just bringing down the hatchet right away with our harsh words. Because while that might feel good in the short term, and while it may get results, more than likely it probably won't, and then it hinders your ability to be effective and help the organization later on, right? So, how are you being made holy by the crosses you bear? And it's because of Luther's doctrine of vocation that he said this. Now, I just read something that burst my bubble. Someone said, Luther actually never said this, so I don't know if that's true or not, but this gets trotted around all the time, where Luther would say, the handmaiden milking her cows does a greater work for the kingdom of God than any monk ever has. And whether Luther said that or not, he would have said that because she is putting food on the table for the family. While the monk who's praying his days away in the monastery, what good is he really doing for society? See, Luther saw the monastery as running away from all your responsibilities and vocations. And isn't that kind of what we want to do when we have problems at work? Boy, I just want to retire someday so I don't have to go to this office and deal with these people, right? And that's kind of a monastery mentality. I want to separate myself from the world. And Luther said, no, your vocations call you into the world, and yeah, you're going to bear crosses, but that's part of how God disciplines you and chastises you as his dear child. So what I thought I'd do is, oh, by the way, you can't read this, I know, I'm not going to go through it, but this is Luther's Small Catechism. We talk about the 6 chief parts, right? What are they? The Creed, the 10 Commandments, Lord's Prayer, the 2 sacraments, baptism and Lord's Supper, and then the third-ish sacrament, the office of the keys. Well, there is a 7th chief part to the catechism. And it gets overlooked, I think, because we number them as 6, but that's the table of duties in the back of the catechism. And so what I've done here is organized the table of duties by the various spheres. So I know you can't read this very well, but what do husbands owe their wives? And then there's a Bible verse. What do wives owe their husbands? And then there's a Bible verse. What do parents owe their children? And what do children owe their parents? You could think about this as the responsibilities we have, each of us, in the sphere of our family. The sphere of the economy. What do slaves owe their masters is how it reads in the catechism, because that's the scriptural language. But I think a more modern way of thinking about that would be, what do workers owe their supervisors or their bosses, and what do supervisors owe their workers? In the sphere of the church, what the hearers owe their pastors. Oh my goodness, there's like 4 or 5 verses here. And then lastly, the sphere of citizenry, what do citizens owe their nation? And I often think that people have the most difficult time thinking about their callings as a member of society. I mean, I go vote, great. I get to do that once every 4 years for the president, and less than that for or maybe more frequently for local leaders. But I just want to read you a few verses here. What are your responsibilities as a citizen of your nation? Well, Romans 13, submit to the governing authorities. Romans 13, pay taxes, give respect, and give honor. 1 Timothy 2, I urge then first of all that prayers and intercessions and thanksgivings be made for everyone. And then I like how the NIV puts it, actually, especially for kings and those in authority, that we may live quiet lives. And then 1 Peter again, submit to the governing authorities. So think about that. Just praying for your leaders regularly, being a law-abiding citizen, paying your taxes. I mean, take your deductions, yes, don't be stupid, but pay what you owe. There's a lot more there that we can do every day of our lives than just, vote once a year. There's more to our responsibility as citizens than just doing that. Now, I came up with this list by myself, and this may be getting dated, but I think there's some vocational insights that we overlook sometimes. 7 mistakes I've delineated here, and you could add your own nuances to this list, but I thought this is helpful to go through. So in the sphere of the economy, mistake number 1, placing our jobs as top priority above all other vocations. All right, we need to resist the temptation to worship our work. And I think this is trending in the right direction in American society today, but there's still, look, at the end of the day, that's your biggest paycheck, and that's what you think you need to survive. And so who cares if I've got to be out of town on the birthday of my kid or something like that, or who cares if I have to work late hours because I've got to do this. So just more work-life balance. Recognize that this is just one of many spheres you have responsibilities in. In the sphere of the family, or forgetting the family is the most important calling each of us has. Think of the 10 Commandments. There's the 3 on loving God. Don't have any other gods. Don't misuse God's name. Remember God's day. And then when we shift to loving our neighbor, what's the first commandment listed? Honor your father and your mother. So all the second table commands, the family takes the place of prominence, right? And showing us that the family unit and that fundamental aspect of society is more important than any other thing. And that's why, when moms, what do you do? And I'm just the stay-at-home mom. It's like anybody who's ever done that knows that changing diapers and doing laundry and cleaning a house and taking care of a baby is so much harder than going to the office and, sharing the latest email joke that came with your cubicle mate next door. Everybody knows that. And so we need to honor and esteem that as a high and holy calling, perhaps the highest. In the sphere of citizenry, I already kind of mentioned this mistake, feeling like we can't have an impact and so we ignore it altogether. That's why I went through. There's actually a lot of things that you can do that make a difference. And very few people will be called to make a difference at a national level, right? Even, maybe a few more at a state level, but what about at a local level? Is there a way you can plug into your community and use your gifts? Because that's where the real difference is made. The smaller the setting, the more chance you have to actually make an impact on an individual. So don't think that has to be big and grand to be important. Listen, if you've had kids try to play youth sports these days, you'll recognize just a good role model of a coach who can half organize the team is a huge blessing to any parent who decides to enroll their child in that sport program. If you have the opportunity and can help in that capacity, do it. You're doing a huge blessing for families. In the sphere of the church, mistake number 4, I can get what the church offers me on my own. I hear this often, right? I don't need to go there, right? I can read my Bible, I can pray. God provides forgiveness and fellowship within the body of Christ. There's no model in the history of Christianity for the lone Christian doing it all by themselves. We're baptized into the body of Christ, we become members of the body. It's in the body of Christ where God's gifts of salvation and forgiveness are given. And it's the body of Christ we lean on in our time of need. So don't think we can get that other places. Mistake number 5 when it comes to the church, someone else will take care of the things that need to be done. No, they won't. Believe me, right? We're pretty blessed here at Zion, but even still, we can have a difficult time filling every position or everything that we do around here. Know that the church needs your gifts. Find what you're good at, plug in, and help, and realize it's not always a picnic just because it's helping at church. It's part of what we're called to do. Mistake number 6 also involves the realm of the church. Things I do for my church are more holy or important than other callings of my life. Not true. I sing in the choir, I sit on this board, I do this board, I do that board, and all of a sudden your whole life is spent at church, and why? Well, that's God work, that's more important. Not necessarily. So yes, your church needs your gifts, but not to the extent that you make the church your own monastery, and you think, I gotta be at all these meetings and do all this stuff, and maybe my family gets neglected from that. And that's a temptation for pastors too, because they could always tell their family, hey, I gotta go serve God in my job, right? I can't help you. And then finally, this is another potential mistake, that our faith only matters at church, that it doesn't inform the other spheres. Sometimes we have a tendency to kind of keep church things at church, and how we are out in the world differently, and how we are at our jobs and our families different yet. And our calling as disciples permeates every sphere of existence God brings us into. And I think maybe I told this story to Acts Bible Study, I can't remember. My dad once worked with this guy who was a supervisor at a factory he worked at, and this guy was in our choir in my home church. And our choir, there was a balcony, but it wasn't big enough, so they sat in kind of a bank of pews in the front left of the church, just in front of the chancel. And my dad said it was always so hard for him to watch this guy sing like he was a choir angel, right, on Sunday morning, but that guy was the meanest, most unforgiving, slave-driving boss, and nobody liked him, and he was just harsh in every single way. But then at church, he'd be up there singing in the choir, see? So he needed to let his calling as a Christian filter over into how he cared for his workers. Now, I mean, there is a place for accountability and being strict and stern and all that, but not being a jerk, right? And so we can't put our church face on Sunday morning and then be someone totally different Monday through Saturday. So I don't know if those are helpful or not. I put that list together about 10 years ago. Just common vocational oversights that we have. But to kind of wrap up, yeah, we're right on time here. I'll let kind of Bierman's book take the last word. Talking about why are we talking about work? Well, because we're going to talk about leisure next week, and then we're going to bring the two together in the third week, or the sixth week of the class. So Bierman says that work is not simple, nor is it hopelessly complicated. When seen in the light of the Creator's plan for His creation, a right understanding of work emerges. Humans are built to work. To be human is to work. And yet, I don't work for my own sake, but for the sake of others. When rightly understood, the work we do has at once everything to do with God and nothing to do with God. Work is established by God and directed by His will. Work is His idea. And yet, when we do the work God has given each of us to do, our vision settles on the world around us, and our attention is absorbed by the situation and needs of our neighbors. The Creator gives us our work, but we do our work for the sake of our fellow creatures. All work is God-pleasing and holy when it is done in obedience to God's will and for the sake of the neighbor. So we talked about work today, which seems far afield. Next week we're going to talk about leisure, and that seems a little more Sabbath-like, right? Leisure. Oh, this chart's right. And then we'll talk about how these polar opposites factor into living a receptive life, open to God's callings, and what it has to do with Sabbath living. So that's all the time I have for today. I will take any questions that anybody has. Yeah, Doug?
I think it's Luther that said it, but I always think of work as my job is to apply my gifts to the best of my abilities to serve my neighbor.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful summary of what work is, yeah. And I think even in the light of that, we have to realize that work has not been so simple for humans to conceive of because it's a complicated thing, right? Because it's both gift and curse. Yeah.
Well, but I think the other piece of this is today in our culture, we still bear so many of the shadows of the industrial age. And so when people think about work and they think about even things like retirement, so much of the industrial age is still imposed upon us, and I encourage everyone to break out of that mold, because the industrial age had a lot of great things, but also some bad.
Yeah, so we're moving from industrial-based to largely service-based, but it's even more complicated than that on a global level because we still rely on the goods and products that are now being produced largely elsewhere, and the kind of conditions that our workers in the Industrial Revolution faced are sometimes being faced other places, and so yes, we're kind of myopic in thinking about work through our American life here in St. Charles County in our modern age, but if Christianity is for the whole world and we step back and we look at sometimes work conditions throughout the world and different things, we have to realize every economist who ever came along with a theory was reacting against something about work that's not great. And so that allows us to look at contributions of socialists and capitalists, right? And see how they both have value to offer, and they probably have some things that they're overlooking again, right? And we need to not worry so much about that, but to step back and think about God's purpose for work. And I'm a worker in this world, so what is God's purpose for me through the things He calls me to do? So, yeah, helpful. Did that help? Anybody else? All right. Thanks once again. There's 3 lessons to go. Have a great week. That begins.